Welcome to the Two Blokes Chatting radio show on 94.7 The Pulse. Music, interviews, news, and, well, Two Blokes Chatting. Now, here are the two blokes.
Hey, it is 5 minutes past 10 o'clock. It's the Two Blokes Chatting radio show, and we spoke to this bloke about 18 months, I think it was September 2020, where he had just released a book called Crimo, the story of Peter Crimmins. I'm surprised this one's not called Huddo, the story of Peter Hudson, to keep a theme going. Camo, who have we got on the line?
We have got Dan Eddy. He's a great writer. He loves football. I don't know if he barracks for the Wees or Poos or not, but he's written two stories about two of their icons. Dan, welcome to the Two Blokes Chatting radio show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Now, I must admit I'm a black and red fan, but I've made some great friends researching these Hawthorn stories. So I've got a secret crush on the club, certainly that era.
Well, let me make sure that you enjoy this interview, because I can tell you for something, at 4:35 this afternoon, your day gets very, very miserable very, very soon. Sorry, that's just a bit of trash talk from the Mighty Lions. Hey, I've actually had the good fortune of skimming through the book. I must acknowledge too, folks out there, yesterday at 3 o'clock we didn't have a guest for this particular segment, and Dan has done this at the absolute last minute. We're going to talk to him in a couple of weeks, but thanks for stepping up to the plate so quickly. I've had a quick chance to flick through the book. The thing that staggered me first off was how many people you spoke to get this story.
Yeah, I guess it's something I pride myself on. Same with Crimo. I probably interviewed a couple of hundred people for Crimo, and I did 150 or so for Huddo again. And it's important, I think, to do that, because that's the way you really get a rounded picture of someone. You can interview the subject, which I spent hours and hours with Peter and Steph and the family, but sometimes they're focused on what they're doing, and they don't, they're not aware of what other people think of them or any of that. So I interviewed umpires, I interviewed opponents who many of them admitted they had nightmares on a Friday night before they had to play on him. Umpires gave a great perspective. I interviewed the great John Kennedy about him. Friends and family, just to really try and capture what made Huddo the great player and icon that he became.
I think one of the other things I liked about the style of the book is I've read a few books where, clearly people have spoken to, the David Parkins of the world, and then they've taken David's words and basically interpreted what he meant. In your situation, it's actually almost like snippets from each of these people, isn't it?
Yeah, I read a couple of great biographies from America, one on Truman Capote and one on J.D. Salinger, a couple of great authors. And
who did they play for?
They had a couple of games for university back in the day, I think. But they were written in an oral history type way. So rather than me just tell you what happened, I've got everyone else telling you what happened, and I just fill in the gaps along the way. I just thought hasn't really been done much with footy before, so I just thought I'd try it, and thankfully Peter liked the style, and if he was happy, I was happy.
When you open the batting with David Parkin as the first two words beyond the intro, it's a fairly good start, isn't it?
Yeah, you got to start big, but I thought we better start with the knee injury, the major incident. As Mike Sheehan says, everything discussed in the 1970s was around Huddo's knee, and it's quite amazing. This Friday coming up is the 1st of April. It's 50 years since he did his knee. It's hard to believe.
Wow.
Oh, indeed. Hey, Dan, we had a 1,000-goal mark passed last night. Peter Hudson did not do that in the VFL, and his knee probably had a fair bit to do with that. But just to throw some numbers around at people who are listening that may not have even heard of the name of Peter Hudson, but his work in Tasmania before and around the knee getting better, and then at the end of his Hawthorn career, some astonishing numbers for total career goals. Yeah,
I really wanted to delve into that because I'm based in Victoria, and us Vics probably don't understand just how big he was in Tassie back pre-Hawthorn and then post-Hawthorn. But, between 1962 and 81, he played, I haven't got the numbers in front of me, but say it's 350-ish senior games in all competitions, and he kicked over 2,000 goals at an average of 5.88. So that means every time he's gone out in 300-odd games over, 17, 18, 19 years, he's kicked at least 5-6 goals. It's hard to comprehend, but he just had this knack. The players just knew that they had this special talent up forward, and they kicked to him, and the coaches worked around him, and he was good enough to get it more often than not. And let's not forget that the players today play on carpets with about 10 dry balls to choose from, and Hutto was playing in mud heaps with probably one waterlogged medicine ball, and it's pretty amazing what he was able to do. But in Tassie, goals after goals. He's the first bloke in a senior competition to kick 200 goals in a season, which he did in his mid-30s in 1979. So despite all his Hawthorn feats, he went back to Tassie and just amassed these massive numbers.
I think.
Dan,
Sorry, I was just going to finish something that Dan mentioned. I think I'm right in saying I read in the book last night that he played 365 games. I think was the magic number, and only 3 games he didn't score a goal.
3 games for Victoria in the VFL, and then 1 in Tassie and 1 in a state game. So 5 times only, and 2 of those games he went off injured before the end of the game. So technically, you're right, 3 full games where he was out-goaling.
Yeah, I read that in the book last night.
Well done, research. Hey, Dan, we've talked about his unique talent at winning the ball, but it always astounded me, and I know from listening to others around him, his style of kicking the ball was also very unique, and it was something that he just found suited him. But it didn't sort of make any sense how he would get the ball from hand to foot and through the goals, because nothing seemed right about it.
No, I think one of his mates joked to him once that his style was like a dog making love to a tennis ball. So you can, it's quite an image, isn't it? But
sorry, we're now going for the rest of the show. We won't be able to concentrate. We're now going to be thinking about that for the rest of the day. Thanks.
We thought we wouldn't put that picture on the cover, but but his theory was getting his hand as close to his boot as possible when he kicked, so there was no chance of the wind blowing it away, which Tony Lockett later did more as his career went on. He was more hunched over and did that as well, and it's no coincidence that those two become legends of the game. But he had the theory that hitting the ball more on the flat of the ball than the point, like we do with the drop punt, so he was using more of a flat punt. I've tried to do it. I don't know if you guys have, but it's not the easiest kick to master.
No, it made no sense.
No, and he had the knack, though, to be able to bend it back from angles, a bit like how Tom Hawkins drifts his to the right. He was able to do that somehow as well, and he was a genius at it, as the title says.
Now, my recollection of those times, and Dan, you've got to understand that Rob was in his mid-40s when Hudson was just starting out, and maybe not. But my recollection of the footies in those days were they weren't quite as structured in terms of the point wasn't necessarily as obvious, particularly when they got waterlogged. Unfortunately, he played at Glenferrie Oval where it was never wet. Ha ha. I suspect that there would have been an unreliability kicking a drop punt that you wouldn't necessarily see now because the ball is a better shape and as you say, not waterlogged.
Yeah, well, that's probably a good theory, actually, because, because it is heavier, it's probably not floating as much as if we were kicking one today, if we were trying to use the flat part of the footy today, because it is a bit, they're a bit harder and a lot drier than even the last night's wet weather. I'm sure they were pulling dry balls out of the bags at the end of the game there, whereas Pete didn't have that luxury. So, he's a master. Whatever it was the same at soccer and played a bit of basketball, different things. Cricket, he was one of those guys. The only sport he hasn't mastered, and I did interview a couple of cows in a paddock next to a golf course, was Peter Hudson, because was golf, because I got told by a couple of good sources that the cows are known to run down at the Dunes golf course on the peninsula whenever Pete tees off.
Yeah, the cows, when I play on the same course, it's not an issue because I generally clear them by some distance as well.
Dan, there was something else that was unique. There was a lot of people that played the game. I think the best example is Lee Matthews, who I think was modest in some sort of ways, but he had a persona that was anything but modest. It was arrogance personified. But Hudson was modest, and everything you saw about him and listened to him say. You spent a lot of time with him personally. Is the modest almost ridiculously modest?
Yeah, sometimes I think he's too humble, if that's a trait that you can have, because he even probably the best example is the title of the book. You said maybe we should have called it Huddo. He probably would have been comfortable with that. Whereas when I said to him, I've got this quote we want to use for the title, a football genius, he was very uncomfortable about that, because he didn't want anyone to think that he was calling himself that. And when I told him that that's what John Kennedy said you were, he realised that it was a pretty appropriate title. But yeah, Pete, it's rare, isn't it? I know when Royce Hart, probably about his fourth season, he released a book and he got some bad publicity around it, and that really sat uncomfortably with Pete, because he never wanted to have anyone criticise him for thinking he was better than he was, or speaking out of place. So it's probably one of the main reasons he hasn't written his book to this point. I'm thankful that we met and we clicked a few years back and we were able to do this story, but that was probably one of the reasons he didn't self-promote himself, because it's even Steph, his wife, says that for all his great career, when it wasn't until he became a legend in the Australian Football Hall of Fame in 1999, that's when it really sunk in for her just how great he was, because she hadn't, living in the Peter Hudson bubble, it wasn't, they just lived a normal life as best they could, which was hard when he was at the peak of his powers. But yeah, so that comes from his mother and father. They were really big on that when he was a kid, that you're never allowed to think you're better than anyone else, even though you're kicking a million more goals.
Because I think the other thing is there's a generation of people a little younger than me and a lot younger than Rob who would think of P. Hudson as being a bloke who played footy for Hawthorn, and the Bulldogs, in terms of his son Paul. And Paul was a bit more like what you would expect a modern-day footballer to be, your sort of traditional half-forward flanker. So if you're thinking that that's what Peter Hudson was like, they were very, very unalike, weren't they? Yeah,
that's true. Again, both very lovable and approachable guys. They've got fantastic natures. But yeah, Paul was not as tall as his father, and he knew that from a young age. I mean, he copped a bit over the fence and that you're not as good as your dad, and those sort of comments that
my son gets that.
We hear too often. Yeah, my dad says it to me. But he knew his place and he knew what his strengths were, and Pete never tried to force him to do anything. It was all Paul doing it his own way, and Pete was just there for guidance when he needed it. But Paul's hero was Peter Knight. He wasn't even his dad, but that his hero was. So they have a laugh about that. But Peter's most proudest moment really is watching Paul win the 91 premiership. That moment for him just stands out as one of the most special days of his life, to see his son become the first father-son in Hawthorn's history to both win premierships for the club.
Dan, a lot of geniuses of the game just float in and be geniuses, then disappear. But Peter Hudson put on a completely new hat and became an administrator and was quite successful at it. Did you find that sort of odd because of his type of character, or just a natural thing, and that sort of allowed him to be modest, humble, away from the game? I just happen to play footy now. I'm just happening to be a administrator, because he was pretty darn good at it. Yeah, we come up through that era where you still worked your 5-6 days a week, and then your footy money was a bit of a bonus really at the time. And so he worked in a bank for a while, and then when he did his knee, he got an offer to go back and work to run a pub in Hobart, the Granada Tavern, and he turned that into the most thriving place in the city. And that really gave him, running that and having to manage 60 staff and throw people out of the pub when they'd had too much to drink and all those sort of things, I think hardened him up a bit and made him not a ruthless administrator, but made him someone who just would make decisions and knew that sometimes you had to make the tough calls. And he was thrown in a couple of pretty hairy situations. He was at St Kilda during a fantastic era for the Saints, but there's a lot going on off the field, and the admin aren't happy that Ken Sheldon and Huddo are running the show almost unofficially. So Pete's in a bit of controversy there. So eventually he leaves there and goes back to Hawthorn, and suddenly there's a merger on, and he has to be the guy to try and push it through. So you can imagine how difficult that was for him. But again, he sees that
he's able to look at that with a good perspective because he always had the best intentions at what he was trying to do. Even if not everyone agreed with certain things, he was doing what he thought was best for the club at that time. And so, the pub certainly set him up and he also became a coach after his knee injury at Glenorchy. And if you talk to the players there, he was a John Kennedy clone, although he didn't train as hard as Kennedy did, but he made the players train as hard.
Because I actually remember going to the Granada Tavern when I was 13, 14, something like that, on a family holiday, not by myself, you understand. And he was working the pub. Like, he was there, he was walking around the tables and just being really genuinely engaging. And that's the thing, that was the only time I ever met him to this point. We might get him on the show at some point.
We might.
That'll be the next. But, it just struck me that he was a really genuine bloke. That's the thing that came through. And often when administrators are like that, they come across as a bit weak, but he didn't come across as weak at all, did he?
No, that's what surprised me in a way, knowing Pete and knowing how, a gentle giant that he is. It's hard to imagine him being a ruthless businessman and, a pretty hard taskmaster as a coach as well, because but he was able to do that, and that adds a part to his story that I don't think many people will realise. We just see the lovable, approachable guy who was amazing on the footy field, but he was able to transcend that and go on. And his pub was flying; it was enormous down there, and obviously people went there because of his name. But he made, and it was a real family pub. A lot of his family worked in it as well. He was able to do that because of the person he was, and he's still spoken of so fondly by the people who frequented there. I dropped in there, and there were a couple of guys there that were still at the bar when Pete was working there.
and they haven't been home.
Hey, let's talk a bit about Dan Eddy. You intrigued me because you've written 2 books about Hawthorn legends, and you barrack for Essendon, who is the club that, allegedly hates Hawthorn more than most. You told me off air your next project, which is a fascinating one. Are you ever going to write about Essendon?
I have. I've actually done 3 books now about the Bombers. My first book ever was on the great Dick Reynolds, which was, amazing, delving back into the 30s and 40s of the club. And I was always a big lover of footy history, but obviously Essendon history as well. And so I was fascinated by them at a young age. And then a few years ago I wrote a book called Always Striving, which was a look at the club's sort of moments throughout the club's history. And then just this last year, the club asked me to write their official 150-year history book. So that will actually be out.
Ah, right. I've heard a little bit about this.
Yeah, so it's a special collector's item one, so that was a great honour to do that as well.
We've got, the show's got a connection. We've interviewed John Burt on more than one occasion. And I was talking to John. He told me that he'd had a bit to do with that, and another fella, Gary Fenton, who's an ex-Essendon player down here, and they're very excited about that book.
Yeah, John's a bit like a Peter Hudson.
They're very much so.
Such gentle men that have achieved a lot in the sport. I'm on the AFL Premiership Players Club Committee with John Burt, and he's still going strong in his 80s. He's leaving me for dead in terms of what he does every day. He's amazing. But, so that was a great honour to be able to do that as well. So it's been despite lockdown, it's been a busy period writing Hutto and the Bombers book at the same time.
Just on, John, you're talking about the modesty side of it, but I was intrigued by the relative situation that I have as admiring heroes, and you go up a level. And I remember talking to John about his own career, and he didn't want to talk about it. All he wanted to talk about was how amazing it was for him to have been recruited by Dick Reynolds, played with Billy Hutchison, and coached by John Coleman, the 3 greatest Essendon figures in history. And he was just embarrassed to be mentioned in their company, and a bloke whose record itself is extraordinary. Yeah,
you're spot on, and he's been approached by a couple of guys I know just to tell his story in a book form, and he's really uncomfortable with the thought of it. But if you have a look through his personal scrapbooks at home that obviously his mum and dad must have kept, you just wow at how much he actually achieved. And he was a fantastic player. He coaches, he's administrator at a lot of clubs, and he's had a lot of impact over many, many years. And Yeah, so it was great to involve John in the book. I got a lot of guys to write letters for me as well, so that there are sort of inserts in the book. So you've got Ken Fraser and who else? Greg Sewell, Leon Baker. The list goes on. It was fantastic to be able to sort of cover all the eras and hopefully bring this history to life in a different way.
It's interesting because the first time I met John Burt, we were in this studio. Rob was hosting a show called Sports Fix, which he still does after 11 o'clock, folks. And I was invited as a co-host that day, and we had John Burt and Cole Hutchison, you know, the AFL historian.
Mm.
We just sat back, Rob and I sat back and let these two blokes talk about it. Was just an extraordinary conversation.
Yeah, it would have been. Cole knows literally everything that's ever happened in football. So in between him and Bertie, it would have been an amazing chat. I'm sorry if you can hear the fire alarm going off in the background, guys. We've got a bit of a fire warning in town by the looks of it.
That's right.
Dan, can people get on, if you've got a website or something, they can get on and have a look at your work? Because it seems like you've got a good body of stuff that footy nuts can tap into.
Yeah, daneddybooks.com has all my books there. And as for Hutto, certainly Hardy Grant Books and SlatteryMedia.com and also the Hawk's Nest shop are best to get on and get Hutto. But if you want personally signed copies, Dan Eddy Books, I'll have books in about a week. So once they arrive, I'll do that. We've got our big launch on Thursday at the MCG in the Sports Museum, guys. So it's going to be a fantastic day. We've got the 71 Premiership Cup there, and it's going to be great. So from this week, you'll be able to get your books, and Dan Eddy Books, I've got a few stories on there. There's a great story. Check it out, guys. I got together Hutto, Peter McKenna and Alex Jesaulenko to recreate a photo taken 50 years ago. Got them together to do that, and we put them in the same positions, and it's fantastic. There's a story behind that as well, so they can check that out.
Excellent. If you're ever in Geelong, Dan, give us a call. We'd love to have you to come and sit in the studio and just talk about stuff. There's plenty of formats to do that at this station, and certainly love your work. And people who are either mad Hawthorn or Essendon or just lovers of the game, Dan Eddy Books will help you out.
I'd love to come down, guys. That sounds great. Thank you. Put the coffee on for me, and I'll be there ASAP.
Rob's got a show starting at 11.
All right, I'll get in the car.
You're a specialist at short notice.
You pay my speed fine, won't you?
Yeah, right. Thanks, Dan. Dan Eddy, thanks for joining us, and thank you for such short notice too. That was fantastic.
Really appreciate your support, mate, and best wishes with the book. I'm sure it'll do a good job.
Anytime, and thanks again for all your support, guys.
No worries at all. There he is, Dan Eddy.